Every writer struggles with the boring parts of their novel. The parts when they read it over, they're like, that's just not that exciting. And then for whatever reason, you can't delete the scene. You have to keep it in. Now, the very obvious solution, which works, 99% of the time, is to add a jet ski chase instead. Maybe 4 or 5 or 6 jet ski chases throughout your book. However, if that isn't gonna work for you, then I would recommend one of these 8 solutions. We're gonna look at the 8 types of scenes which are often boring in your book, and then I'm gonna help you figure out how to make them way more fun. The first one is getting characters from one place to another. So these are transitional scenes where your character is walking or driving or flying to a new location. And some of the time, you don't want to cut these scenes. So here are 4 things that you can do to make those transitional scenes way more exciting. The first one is just to insert some artificial conflict. For instance, say there's some sort of danger on the trip, like someone is following them. Or if you don't want someone actually to be following them, just have them worry that someone is following them. The second technique is a ticking clock. If someone only has 5 or 10 minutes to get to the next location, then suddenly their journey becomes a lot more exciting for the reader. A third thing you can do when a character is transitioning or traveling to a new place is some characterization work. There's this very long car ride scene in the very first season of True Detective where Rust and Martin are talking to each other. And Rust lays out some just wild dialogue. Stuff like, consciousness was a mistake in human evolution. The honorable thing is to make the human race go extinct. Now, if your character's traveling by themselves, have them do number 4. Give them an epiphany. Mickey Spillane wrote One Lonely Night. His PI, Mike Hammer, leaves the courtroom after this judge just calls him like this low-life killer, and he's driving in his car and he just gets this internal reckoning. He says, maybe I did have a taste for death. Maybe I liked it too much to taste anything else. Maybe I was twisted and rotten inside. So that's not a boring travel scene because he's having this huge reevaluation of who he is as a person. Now, a second boring place that a lot of writers struggle with is when they are describing a place, otherwise known as scene setting. Now, lengthy descriptions can often feel very boring to the reader, and the obvious solution is to trim them a little bit. But I think I have a better solution. It is a wonderful strategy that will improve any scene setting. There are 2 ways to describe a place: static description and dynamic description. I feel like the most boring descriptions of place are mostly static descriptions and not enough dynamic descriptions. And here's what I mean by both of those. Static description is treating the place as if it is independent from your character. For example, the cars were all streaked with mud splatters because of yesterday's rain. The hot dog vendor rolled his cart down the sidewalk around little puddles. So that's static description. Now let's look at dynamic description. And dynamic description is just when your character is interacting with the place that you're describing. When she stepped off the curb, a taxi running a red light honked at her and swerved. The hot dog vendor stared too long at her and she pulled her coat tighter. So why is dynamic description better? Because it involves someone we care about. We care about your main character, right? And so if we see things happening to that main character, our emotions are involved, we're instantly interested in the scene. Now, I'm not saying never do static description. Please don't misunderstand me. What I'm saying is pay attention to the ratio between dynamic and static and push more of your description toward the dynamic and have a little less static. And it's also a good idea to mix these 2 things. Don't have a paragraph of all static and then have a paragraph of dynamic. Have them interspersed with each other. The third very common boring place in your novel is the everyday. This is stuff like going to the bathroom or eating or folding laundry. Phyllis Whitney, who's this author of about 70 mystery novels, she said that the only time you should have your character folding laundry is when the reader knows that the axe murderer is right behind them. Now, I get what she's saying is that when you have characters doing boring things hey, have the plot intrude, have something exciting come in and break it up. But for a lot of genres, I don't think that's exactly right. And I'm gonna give you 2 examples of things that you can do that are a little less extreme than having an axe-wielding murderer behind your character. The first technique would be something like micro-conflict. Say you have a character who is doing an everyday thing of eating in a restaurant. It's not that particularly exciting. A micro-conflict would be the character saying, oh, my coffee's too cold, or, calling the waitress a derogatory name. Now, these conflicts don't have anything to to do with the major part of the plot, but they help this little tiny boring scene to become a little more exciting. The second thing you can do in an everyday moment is just do a little bit of character building. In American Psycho by Bret Easton Ellis, we have this very typically boring scene of a guy getting ready in the morning. But the intense facial process that he goes through reveals his crazy extreme levels of vanity and egotism. The fourth really common boring place in a lot of novels is predictable conversation. Now, obviously, a lot of dialogue in your book is going to be intrinsically exciting, but there are some conversations, and we're going to look at two particular examples, that are more boring than the others. Now, Michael Crichton has a book called Eruption, and honestly, it's kind of his worst book, like I don't recommend you read it, but it's about a volcano exploding in Hawaii. Now there's a government scientist who needs to have a conversation with a demolitionist because their plan is to blow a hole in the side of the volcano to channel the lava in a different direction. Now how would you write this? Take a second and actually think about it. You're probably thinking of having the government scientist go to a location and talk to the demolitionist and say, hey, we need to blow a hole in the side of the volcano. And the demolitionist is like, what? Okay. But, here's how Michael Crichton handled that conversation. He has two parts. One, he has a demolition gone wrong. They're supposed to blow up this giant building, and for some reason it's not working. They worry whether it's gonna explode and like kill people or something. It's not working. And then finally, it works. And the whole building explodes and comes down into rubble. And then a white van of the government scientist pulls up, throws open the door, there's military guys in there, and they say to the demolitionist, hop in, we need your help. So what Michael Crichton did is he skipped all that more predictable conversation that we could sort of guess how it would go, and instead he had dramatic action. Another example of predictable conversation is when the reader knows information that one character needs to give to another character. So obviously you don't want the character to explain at length because then the reader's gonna be like, man, I know all of this already. I'm gonna blow your mind right now with the solution. It's amazing, it's incredible, you will never forget it. It is just have them summarize what they said. Summary, she told him what had happened. Boom, you're done. That's all you need, right? Because the reader knows, oh, they communicated. Now he knows what she knows, or whatever it is. A fifth boring place that we are going to rehabilitate in your novel is detailed explanations of technical processes or systems. Now, every time I bring this up, there are always people in the comments who complain that like, oh man, this is my favorite part of every novel. And that's cool. That's cool. I don't disagree that there are some people who love it. But in general, the longer you stick with a technical process or system, it's like a war of attrition on your readers. You lose more and more and more. Now, why do people include this in their book? Maybe it's because you researched a lot and you're really excited to get all that information in there.
I did my research.
Maybe it's part of your world building and you really want to make sure people understand what this world is like. Or sometimes it's just author expertise. And the example we're going to look at is because of that. We're actually looking at another Michael Crichton example, but this time as an example of what not to do. This is Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton, and he included a lot of technical medical details because he graduated from Harvard Medical School. So I want you to look at this text, and I'm not going to read it all because it's extremely long, but if you want to, you can pause the video and read it for yourself to get a sense of what I'm talking about. It's about X-ray technology, and he explains like, oh, this is like how it works. Now, I want you to imagine that going on for 2 pages, for 3 pages, for 4 pages. How long do you think the average reader is going to keep reading being like, ooh, I'm really fascinated by this? Now, maybe you say to me, John, I hear you on that, but I really want to include this stuff in my book. All right. Here are 4 ways to do it in a much more entertaining way. 1, just put it in dialogue. If you have one character explaining the information to another, that back and forth makes it much more entertaining than huge blocks of text. 2, add some sort of conflict or time pressure. If someone needs to know this information before something really bad happens within a short period of time, it makes the explanation naturally shorter, but also it's more entertaining for the reader because they know like, oh no, is this bad thing going to happen before this can be explained? A third really obvious solution is simply to abbreviate it as much as possible. Can you take those 2 pages of explanation and shrink it down to a paragraph? And lastly, the 4th thing that you can do is simply intermix this information with the story plot. So instead of having it in a 2-page chunk, take out the most pertinent examples or information and then put it across an entire chapter. and have plot events happen periodically in between to keep the reader hooked on the plot. A sixth place in your book that can get very, very boring is extensive backstory dumps. Now, I'm not against backstory. I think some backstories are absolutely wonderful, but then there are other backstories that become painful to read, and a lot of readers end up skipping to the present moment story because that's what they actually care about. The trick is how to make sure your backstory is the backstory that people love to read and not the backstory that people are bored by. So let's talk about what makes a boring back scene and then what you can do to rehabilitate it into something that's fantastic. 1. The worst backstory is information. Oh, they went to this college and then they moved to this town. The best backstory, on the other hand, uses dramatic action and conflict to make that backstory just as exciting as the present moment story. The second mistake that a lot of writers make with backstory is it's simply too long. Sometimes a summary is a much better choice than having scenes, lots of scenes to show all this backstory. A third really common mistake is if it's not clear to the reader how this backstory impacts the present moment scene. There needs to be a very clear connection where the reader gets like, oh, because this happened in their past, that's why they are the way they are now. And the fourth thing to pay attention to is where your backstory takes place. Backstory might be boring if it's in the very first chapter before the reader is hooked on your character and the present moment scene. But that same exact backstory, if you make it in the middle of the novel, might be tremendously more exciting. The seventh common place where your book might be boring is no action dialogue. Now, this is something I talk a little bit about in my dialogue course in Bookfox Academy, and if you don't have access to that, I would really recommend that you subscribe. I have over 250 videos talking about every single aspect of fiction that you can imagine, so if you're missing out on that, consider subscribing. So just in general, dialogue is very entertaining, and people rarely skip dialogue. But I do think that when dialogue gets very long, we're talking about 5 pages of dialogue, 10 pages of dialogue, sometimes an entire chapter of dialogue, it can drag on a little bit. And there's a very easy solution to this. Make them do something. Have them take a walk. Have one of the characters using a knife to cut vegetables. Have one of them folding origami. Or have a conversation happen while they are in a car chase. But one of my favorite examples is actually from The 40-Year-Old Virgin. You have a bunch of guys in the loading dock behind the place where they work, and they're just chatting about stuff, right? But as they are talking, they are taking these long fluorescent tubes and just smashing them to smithereens. Now, that has absolutely nothing to do with what they're talking about, but I know that if they just had that conversation, the scene would be okay. But adding them doing an action makes it 10,000 times more exciting. The eighth, potentially boring place in your novel is a long process. Say your characters are building a house, or maybe they are digging a ditch. For some reason, you need to show that process rather than cutting out entirely, but a long process like that can be really boring. The easy solution is simply to montage that sucker. So you use telling instead of showing, you use summary instead of scenes. That has the action happen very quickly and the reader isn't bored with a lot of minutia and details about how the entire process happened. If that was helpful for you, please click the thumbs up button, please subscribe, and good luck with your writing.